Good morning, Mountainview families. How are we doing today? Good. Oh, no. How are we doing today? There we go. That's better. That's better. I literally almost tripped on these microphones. I don't know if some of you saw this in the blackout. They should not be here. It scares me to death. All right. We're so glad that you are joining us today. We're a little thin because a lot of our guys are at our men's retreat this weekend up in the mountains. And perfect time to be there. It's so beautiful. But we are glad that you're joining us as we continue our series called Stepping Out, kind of learning what it looks like to step out in faith. In this series, and we're looking at the life and the legacy of the father of our faith, Abraham. Bonus points if you are singing the song right now. Anybody singing it? Father Abraham, have any sons? Anybody? I have one of them. Right, left, right foot, left foot. It was like the Christian cha-cha slide. It was a real moment for us. It was a good time, the 80s, great time to be alive. This is such a wonderful story and such an important story that I think oftentimes we overlook because it lacks some of the luster of like the Moseses or the Davids or the Joshuas, some of these kind of bigger people of faith that come. But Abraham is where it all begins, and it's really important. And you can't talk about Abraham without talking about covenant. That's literally like the whole thing. He's kind of the basis of this covenant. A covenant is a promise that's made between two groups or entities or organizations when they come together and they agree to some terms. And God makes a covenant promise with Abraham, which is significant for all of us in this room now and forevermore, as you see the promise worked out through time. And I've been thinking a lot about promises that I've made in my life. I'm a child of the 80s. Wonderful. It's a weird time. It's a weird time to be alive, but wonderful time. I'm a child of the 80s. When I was a kid, if you wanted to make a promise, it came with a spit shake. Has anybody ever had a spit shake? Ew. It's so gross. It's so gross because you go, oh, do you promise? This is, okay, 7 years old, and I was like, I might be a hypochondriac. I don't want to do it. I don't actually like you enough to spit shake. That's dirty. Please don't be spit shaking still. It's so gross, so nasty. This is how germs are spread, folks, how germs are spread. All right, so I spit shook a long time ago when I was in the 80s. As you grow up, maybe you put your name on something. That's usually a way, like maybe you signed like a purity pledge, or maybe you got down on your knees one day and said, God, if you just give me enough money for my Nintendo 64, I will never sin again. Like it was like a moment like that where you just prayed and you made like an agreement. You made an agreement with God on a thing. You sign all kinds of contracts. You sign a marriage contract, or maybe you signed your life away on a mortgage. These are all promises. These are all promises that you've made. I'll hold up my end of the bargain, you hold up your end of the bargain, and as long as we both are doing what we're supposed to do, everything works out for everybody, right? But the moment that a promise is broken, there are consequences. Varying degrees of consequences, but consequences nonetheless. And when promises are broken, I think the biggest consequence that we don't always factor into the equation, or maybe we don't even see how that has impacted our lives, is a lack of trust. When promises are broken, trust is broken. And it doesn't matter who broke the promise, you carry that distrust with you into the next promise. And the next promise, and the next promise, and the next promise. And before you know it, you're super skeptical of maybe everything and everyone. Maybe you don't know a lot of people in your life that can truly be trusted. And the only reason you say that has nothing to do with the individual and everything to do with all of the other promises in your past that have been broken. And as a result of that, nobody can be trusted. And believe it or not, if you continue through this logic, this applies to God. Whether or not you can admit it to yourself, we sometimes think this about God, right? Maybe you feel like you prayed for something and it didn't work out the way you wanted to, and for you, that was a breach of contract. It was a broken promise, and as a result, God feels distant. God feels uncaring. He doesn't care about my needs or what's going on in my life because he didn't do this thing. And I asked him, and I stepped out in faith, and I did all the things I was supposed to do, and he didn't do the thing that I asked him to do. If you have lived or currently live in that place, the very idea of praying for small things, you're like, maybe sometimes. But the idea of praying for big things, for impossible things, is like a non-starter. Like you wouldn't even engage yourself in that conversation. It's completely out of the question for you, right? Because you're not gonna jump off a ledge unless you know there's gonna be someone to catch you when you fall. You're like, what's the guarantee, right? Who is underwriting this contract? Do I have Nationwide? What's going on? Like, I don't know that I'm ready to do this thing and to step out. And almost always, that 100% has to do with all the promises in your past that have been broken. The way that trust has been broken. It's not what's coming in the future. There's just no guarantees. And that scares you. And it's scary enough to just stay on the edge and not pray big prayers. Today, we're going to talk about how we serve a God who can do the impossible. I don't know that we believe that. I don't know that we fully believe that our God can do the impossible thing. And I get it. I get why we might be a little hesitant because is God going to actually do it? How do we muster up the faith to believe in this impossible God and this impossible thing that only a God can do? And how do we know that God's going to make good on the promise if we do step out in faith? That's what I want to talk about today as we look at Abraham's life. If you have your Bibles, we're going to be at the very beginning in the book of Genesis. It's a wonderful and important book. I want to give you a little bit of a backstory on Abraham and his life in case you haven't been here the last couple of weeks, so you can get a little context of what we're talking about. Abraham has not always been his name. It used to be Abram. This is before God changed his name. He lived in the city of Ur. He was doing quite well for himself. He had a wife. Her name was Sarai, but they had no children. And then on one not-so-special day, God calls Abram to leave the comfort of his city life in Ur and begin this journey of faith that's going to result in him being a father of a great nation that we know today as the Israelites. This is the beginning of it. This is kind of very similar calling, by the way, to how Jesus called 12 men to follow him as well. It was like, hey, you're a successful fisherman. How about you stop that and come do this with me? And they're like, all right, same concept. So God calls Abram. He goes, okay, we're going to do this. And him and his descendants, God makes a promise. If you come and do this with me, you, all of your descendants, all other nations of the world are going to be blessed through the nation that your descendants are going to bring forth, the nation of Israel. And furthermore, nations that oppose Israel will be opposed by God, which you come to discover as you get into Exodus and read the story about the Egyptians and Pharaoh and Moses, and a story I know a lot of you know. So Abram says, okay, he becomes nomadic, which is a fancy word for homeless, and he's a shepherd, and he travels through the desert with his wife and his nephew Lot, and he arrives at this place called Shechem, and he builds an altar to the Lord. Interesting fact, hundreds of years later, this site becomes the center of a land that was promised to Abraham's descendants, okay, the promised land, and their leader Joshua ends up taking them there. And eventually, Abraham and Lot, they have to part ways because of a story we don't have time for today, but you should read about it. And Abram allows Lot to have first dibs on the land. So they survey the land, and they say, okay, go ahead, Lot, I'm going to give you first dibs, you pick. Oh, look at this river and this lush green and all the wonderful things I need. I think I'm going to go to this one, okay? And you can have that gross land over there. I'm going to take this land. So Lot goes here with his people and his herds and all this stuff, and he moves into the very lush land where there is a river. It just so happens to be really close to two cities known as Sodom and Gomorrah, which you come to find out later on aren't great cities. And so God has to destroy them. There's a whole thing that goes on with that. Meanwhile, Abram settles in this place called the Oak of Mamre, which is about 20 miles south of Bethlehem. Okay, so now they've divided. He's in the desert land, Lot's in the lush and fertile land. And now we're back to the promises of God. God one night shows him all the stars in the sky, and he says, look at the stars in the sky. And he says, your descendants will be numerous like this. In fact, they'll be too numerous to count. And Abraham is like, great story, but here's the problem. I don't have any children. How does that work? My descendants, are they adopted in? He's like, no. Your descendants will be numerous like the stars, too numerous to count. And he's like, I don't even have one son to my name. How does that even work? But God confirms this covenant for Abram. Abram steps out in faith. God changes his name to Abraham, changes his wife's name to Sarah, and then Abraham gets circumcised. And God has made these big, big promises. And honestly, I get it that he was like, I don't see a way out. I don't see how it's possible for this to be a thing. Are you just talking figuratively like, oh, look at all these stars, all these? Or do you mean literally This is going to happen because I just don't see how it's going to work. That's where our story sets up in Genesis chapter 18, verse 1 and 2. A very fascinating encounter takes place in Abraham's life. The Lord appeared to Abraham, verse 1 says, near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. And Abraham looked up, and he saw 3 men standing nearby. And when he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them, and he bowed low to the ground, which is like a deep sign of respect and honor. This appearing, this moment, is part of a series of heavenly manifestations or announcements that you see all throughout the Bible. It's actually got a name. It's called theophany, and all kind of theophanies follow very similar patterns. There's a divine being that appears. That divine being is met with fear and trembling or laying low, bowing down. There is a word of comfort, like peace, do not be afraid, the Lord is with you, something along those lines. There's a divine message, like the reason why they're sent, and then there's a giving of a sign. And we see it all throughout both Old and New Testaments, most notably in the New Testament with the birth of Jesus. This happens a lot. An angel of the Lord appeared, and people were afraid, and they were like, don't be afraid. And it was like, I'm trying. And it's kind of the back and forth that takes place in that whole moment. We see it a lot with John the Baptist, his announcement, Mary with the birth of Jesus, the shepherds, so forth. In this case of this theophany, there are 3 spiritual beings who suddenly appear. They just are there, like a mirage, right? Most theologians agree that it was the Lord and 2 angels, and they're just there. And Abraham brings great honor to them, and he singles one of them out as my Lord. He says, my Lord, because he knows that this is someone significant. Goes on to say in verse 3, he said, if I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so that you can be refreshed and go on your way now that you have come to your servant. Hospitality was and is a very important cultural expectation in both Old and New Testaments because everybody lived in the desert. Feet were gross all the time. So part of what it meant to welcome guests into your home was to offer them a foot washing. That was very normal, very typical thing. Usually your servants did it on your behalf. You would give them that to wash their feet. You'd give them water, food, a place to sleep. You would be generally hospitable with everything that you had. So the fact that these following verses, 6 and 7, they speak to Abraham and his household, kind of hurrying around to prepare items for the guests, it speaks to what a gracious host Abraham was, and that Abraham knew he was in the midst of greatness. Something great was about to happen. So they get everything ready for these guests. They're all seated. And then one of the guests says to Abraham in verses 9, he says, where is your wife Sarah? They asked him. Oh, there in the tent. Just back here, he said. Then one of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. What? All right, okay, you're doing all you can to maybe be like, okay, that's an interesting thing to say to a person. In verse 11, he says, now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was way past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? This is an amazing, amazing scene because sometimes I can picture myself in this moment, and I feel like if you thought about it, you probably could too. Not only does the Lord reveal to Abraham that within the year, his 90-year-old wife, 90, is going to have a son, okay? And that's going to fulfill a promise that God made to Abraham. But the people are also simultaneously reading Sarah's thoughts that you're going to see here in a minute. When I was a kid, all right, I was a nice kid. I'm not going to lie. It's kind of an oldest kid thing. We're just the best. I was a nice kid. I was a nice, respectful, polite kid. And when I became a teenager, literally nothing changed about my attitude or my behavior, and there's nobody here to tell you otherwise. I can't believe I just lied in church. All right, here's the deal. I may have had the occasional pubescent outburst, all right? The occasional. But for the most part, I was a relatively good kid, okay? Relatively good. I had the occasional moments. One of my mom's most favorite sayings to me was, change your face. It was her favorite thing to say to me. I'd be getting in trouble for something, and the conversation would, kind of go something like, you are the oldest, and you are supposed to set an example for all of your siblings. And she would walk away, and literally she would go, also change your face, because I know you're making a face back there. And she was right, and I kept thinking, how do you know? I was typically bad thinking, you know what I'm saying? Like, she knew. She knew. And I was like, what is happening right now? How do you know? Without missing a beat, she would say, change your face. And I'd go, ugh. Keep it above sea level. Like, you just do all that you can because you don't want to be in more trouble than you already are. We are watching a change your face moment playing out in real time, because when Sarah hears the visitors say that she's going to have a baby, she laughs. But here's the thing. She laughs to herself. This is all internal dialogue. She didn't laugh out loud, super rude. She laughs to herself. Inside, the visitors couldn't see her, they couldn't hear her, but they knew what she was doing, and they knew what she was thinking. And in verse 13, it says this, then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. And Sarah was afraid, and I would be too. So she lied and said, I didn't laugh. And he said, yes, you did. So change your face. That's pretty much what he wanted to say. I saw it. I know you did it. Change your face. And that's what took place. And I love this line. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for the Lord? This Hebrew word for Lord, it's a really fascinating word. And in the right context, it can also mean wonderful and extraordinary. In the right context, and this is one of those contexts. In fact, King David uses this same word in Psalm 139. It's a psalm, if you've read the Psalms, one you've probably heard. He exclaims that the Lord's understanding of the human heart and condition and the Lord's understanding of all future events are too wonderful to comprehend. They're too hard to comprehend. They're too extraordinary to comprehend. Is anything too extraordinary for the Lord? There's two questions that the Lord asks Abraham, and they're both rhetorical. They don't actually need an answer, because the Lord can and will make good on his promises. And because he can, not only was Sarah's internal monologue unnecessary, her skepticism, don't miss this, was unfounded. Her skepticism was unfounded. And here's the point. If God has kept his promises in the past, who are we to be skeptical about the future? Who are we to be skeptical about the future? This way of thinking, this unfounded way, for those of us who believe in God, it's almost like a legal argument here. It's almost as if God were saying, on what grounds do you have to even think that I won't make good on my promises? When have I ever failed you? It is completely unfounded. It's all in your head. This is a subjective, there's no objectivity here. On what grounds do you have to accuse me of being one who isn't going to keep my promises? Is anything too hard for me? That's important, because I think we fall into that category when we deal with our own personal trust issues and our things, and we say, this thing is too big, and it's too big for even God. And he's like, where are you getting that? It's not from me. I'm not telling you that. Where is that coming from? It's unfounded. Later on in chapter 21, it says this, verse 1, of course, just like the Lord said, the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised, and Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time that God had promised him. And Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him just as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old, 100 years old, when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this is going to laugh with me because it's crazy. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Not only was Sarah's pregnancy impossible by human standards, 100, but the birth of her son happened exactly when God said it would be. And they named him Isaac, which means he laughs and he smiles. And I should know because I also named my son Isaac. And he laughs a lot, mostly at me, but he still laughs. It's amazing what once was doubting laughter just a year ago, laughing to herself like, you are out of your mind. This is never going to happen. Now is joyful laughter. She just didn't know what else to do but laugh. I cannot believe this happened exactly like you said it would. All I know to do is laugh. It brings me so much joy and amazement and astonishment. I just laugh at how great and powerful our God is. And Abraham turns the skepticism into an obedient faith by doing exactly what God told him to do, circumcise on the 8th day, name him Isaac, and he did both of those things. And God honors his promises to Abraham, and he makes a great nation from his offspring, starting with Isaac and then moving to Isaac's son, Jacob, or Isaac's son and Isaac's offering to Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is why when God reveals himself to Moses in a burning bush at the beginning of the escape to Egypt, he identifies himself like this: I am the God of your father. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is so good at keeping his promises that he wraps his entire identity around Abraham's lineage. His whole identity. He's like, you want to know what God I am? I'm this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm the one true God. And from that point forth, he said, that's how you're going to refer to me moving forward. That's how you're going to know you're talking to the one true God, because I'm the God of your ancestors. I'm the God of the promise who made a promise to Abraham all those years ago. Same God. The same God. What do we learn from this interesting story about Abraham and what it means to have faith in God to do the impossible? I think the Apostle Paul sums it up beautifully in the book of Romans in the New Testament. This is what Paul has to say about Abraham in Romans 4, verses 18. He says, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed and so became the father of many nations, just as it had been said to him, so shall your offspring be. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. This is why it was credited to him as righteousness. Credited to him as righteousness. Abraham would have been justified, at least from a human perspective, for not believing that God could follow through on his promises. Really numerous, the stars in the sky? It's a lot. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of stars. How is this even possible? But what Abraham did that's such an important thing for us is he believed that God could do the impossible. Wasn't sure how he was going to do it because it was too hard for him to comprehend. It defied human logic and reasoning. It just isn't possible. But he believed God could do it, that he could do the impossible. His hope was not on his inner will or his inner strength to just rise like a phoenix from the ashes and make something amazing happen. His hope wasn't about his ability. There was nothing he could do physically to will a child into existence. He just walked by faith, trusting that God would make good on his promise. He was one of the first to walk by faith and not by sight or the things that we can experience or what you can predict or what you can control. He just said, yes, Lord, and he stepped off the cliff, fully believing God was going to catch him when he fell. Here's the deal. Faith is not irrational. It's only irrational when we put our restrictions on God, preventing him from doing miraculous things in our lives. It's the only time. Not only does Abraham allow God to intervene and to do the miraculous, but he expects God to show up and to love and have love and concern for him in this creation that he created in his own image. I think what that looks like is this idea that God does his best work when you come to the end of yourself. When you can't do it and you fall on your face, you say, I'm out of options. I have nothing. I can't fix it. I can't change it. It's bad. I don't know what to do. That's where God comes in and says, that's all right. That's what I do. The impossible thing. I'm the God of the impossible promise. And it's a promise that was fulfilled. I think God wants to do big things in you and through you if you'd let him. if you'd stop putting your human restrictions, let God step into your mess and do what you've already determined is impossible. I think he wants to. Real talk, that's easier said than done. I'm not going to lie. Super easy for me to stand up here and tell you, oh yeah, well, just do that, have faith, trust. That's super easy. That's not how it works in real life, right? This is hard. What I just said is hard. It's not easy to do. Oftentimes, we are too impatient to wait for God to do big things. Or we can't see what God is trying to do in the moment of our weakness and trial, both of which are understandable. I'm not a patient person. If you said to me, God's going to do a thing, it's going to take him 400 years, I'd be like, forget it. I don't have 400 years. I might have 4 minutes. And that's the reality. This is hard stuff. This is hard. Step out in faith. Let God do the impossible kind of stuff. Asking God to do the impossible, and don't miss this, it doesn't mean that God's going to answer your prayers exactly the way you wanted him to. He's not a genie granting wishes. That's not how it works. Or that the miracle is even going to happen in your lifetime. Certainly no guarantees of that. Or that it's going to happen within the timeline that you need it to in this life. But it does mean that our God is a God who keeps his promises. And through him, all things are possible. All things are possible. I want to end today by talking just a little bit, sharing with you some of the promises of God that I hang on to for dear life, as if my life depended on it, because it does. It so does. Especially when I'm struggling to ask God to do the impossible. And these promises come from Jesus in the New Testament. There's a moment in Jesus' ministry where he's standing at this level place and he's speaking to his disciples, and people from all over Jerusalem have come to hear him speak and to be healed of their diseases, which is something he did a lot, the miraculous, right in front of people. And even Jesus, the Son of God, understood, what do you think is harder for me to do? To tell this man to get up and walk, or to forgive him of his sins? And then he does both. And he's in this moment, he's preaching and teaching and healing, and then all of a sudden he goes into this sermon. And we know this sermon as the Beatitudes. You can find them in Matthew's gospel. The word beatitude is Latin for blessing. That's what it means, blessings. And what follows is a series of contrasting blessings for those who are followers of Christ. And what you see in these blessings are the promises of God. It's a contract, it's an exchange. You do this thing, you be this person, and in exchange I will do this thing for you and be this person for you. And you see this list, and I read this list a lot, because there's such a weightiness and significance to what God is doing with these things and how he wants me to be and how he's trying to shape and form me into a person who looks more like him. So I want to go through this list. I want you to listen. You can close your eyes or not, or just listen and take to heart what Jesus is saying to you, the promises of God in these moments. The first is this: blessed are the poor in spirit. I think oftentimes we think about poor people. The poor in spirit, these are people who recognize that their eternal need for Christ. I literally can't do it without you forever. This is it. I've tried all the things, and all I have is you. That's a poor in spirit person. Do you know what God's promise is to you? It's nothing short of the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is yours when you know Christ is all you have. This is my promise to you. I'm giving you the kingdom of heaven. Here are the keys to the kingdom. I just need you to know I'm your everything. Blessed are the poor in spirit. I pray that I never forget that everything that I am and all that I have is because of Christ, who is my life. Blessed are those who mourn. These are people who grieve because of losses of all kinds: physical, emotional, mental, spiritual loss, who have suffered because of personal sins and the sins of others, or those who have been oppressed. God's promise to you is that comfort is coming. It's coming. I hold on to that promise when I have to ask God to be near to me when I am in deep sorrow or pain or grief. I don't feel good right now, but I know that your comfort is coming, and I pray for a peace that surpasses my current situation. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. These are people who are gentle and humble in heart, just like Christ was. God's promise for you is that you're going to inherit the earth. You're going to inherit the earth. That's a lot. I pray every day that I would be more gentle and humble, especially to those who are close to me but who are far from Christ. I need more patience. I need more gentleness. I need more humbleness for those people. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. These are people who desire to see God's standards obeyed. And God's promise to you is that you will be hungry no more. I pray that God makes things right in our world all the time, and I pray that I would be bold enough to stand for righteousness. Blessed are those who are merciful. These are people who are quick to forgive others and care about the suffering of other people. God's promise to you is that he will show you mercy. Inasmuch as you have given mercy to others, God will give mercy and pour mercy back to you. Blessed are the pure in heart. These are people who have a desire for holiness. They are hopelessly devoted to Jesus Christ. And God's promise to you is you will see God. You know, when people in the Old Testament saw God, they had to turn their face away. He was like, I'm too much. I'm too much for you. I need you to hide under this rock. I need you to turn your face, because if you try to see me, you're going to die. That's how big it is. That's how great it is. You can't handle it. But these people, the pure in heart people, they're going to see God face to face. Blessed are you. I pray to be pure in heart so that I can see God even when everything else around me is falling apart. That I can see the forest through the trees, that I know that God is still there even when he doesn't feel like he's still there. I want to pursue and move toward holiness. Blessed are the peacemakers. Those are people who want to help reconcile others and bring harmony and unity. God's promise to you is that you are children of God. You are children of God. I want to be a child of God. I want to be a child of God. And if Jesus came to make peace between us and God, then I have to learn how to make peace with others, even when the relationship feels beyond reconciliation. It's impossible. It's impossible. Is it? Is anything too impossible for God? And when you are persecuted for holding on to all of these promises of God, just remember the kingdom of heaven is yours. It's yours. I want us to hold on to the promises of God. Impossible promises. Part of what that looks like is a little bit of expectation management on our part. Fully realizing that God isn't a genie. He's not just going to do everything we ask him to do. Maybe not the Nintendo 64, but also realizing we're talking about a faith thing here. We're talking about an exchange. You be God, I'll be your people. That's essentially what's taking place. Old Testament covenant in a New Testament context. You're blessed if you do this, and if you do this, I promise you, I will do this for you. I will be your God. I will transform your life. I will do the impossible. And that doesn't always mean these great, wonderful things. Physical healings, of course, all of these great impossible things. It could also mean the impossible thing inside here. I will make you someone who's more loving, who's more forgiving, who can move on from your past hurts, who can learn to trust again. Wouldn't that be lovely? God can do all those things. It's not too hard for him. He brought you back from the dead. Surely he can fix a broken heart. Surely. This series, and as we keep moving forward, my challenge for you is to pray big prayers, fully trusting that God hears you. And if it's in his will and you're willing to enter into promise, that God's going to follow through to the very end. I'm not sure how. I'm not even sure when. I don't even know what it looks like. I just know that he's never broken a promise. He hasn't failed us yet. Not yet. So I don't anticipate he will anytime soon. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you.